Prologue. In the quiet town of Eldridge, Oklahoma, where the wind whispers secrets through the tall prairie grass, the Harper family's dissolution was a silent explosion that sent shockwaves through the community. The divorce, as it came to be known, was not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a chilling transformation. The Harper house, once a beacon of familial warmth, stood desolate against the backdrop of the sprawling farm. Its windows, like hollow eyes, reflected the fractured soul of a broken home. Jake, a boy on the cusp of manhood, bore the weight of the world in his heart. His parents' love had decayed, leaving behind a carcass of memories that festered in the corners of his mind. The day the divorce was finalized, an eerie silence fell over the land. Jake's mother departed for the city, a place devoid of the ghosts that haunted her every step in Eldridge. Jake remained, a sentinel of sorrow, with his father, a man whose once kind eyes had turned as cold as the winter frost. But the farm was no ordinary place. It was here, beneath the blood-red sunsets, that Jake's ancestors had toiled and bled, their spirits forever etched into the soil. And as Jake's heart split in two, something ancient stirred beneath the earth, awakened by the boy's grief. The nights grew longer, the shadows deeper, and whispers of the past began to claw their way into the present. The divorce had opened a door, and what lay beyond was as terrifying as it was alluring. Jake would soon learn that some bonds, once broken, release more than just pain, they unleash darkness itself. As the first chapter of horror unfolds, remember, in Eldridge, the land remembers, and it never forgets the tears shed upon it. Chapter 1. The Farm. The farm was a desolate canvas, painted with the withered hues of neglect and despair. It stretched toward the horizon like a graveyard of dreams, where the air was thick with the stench of rotting promises. Jake's father, a specter in the twilight, toiled among the ruins of hope, his efforts a futile dance with the dead earth. The soil, once fertile and yielding, now clung to the roots like a curse, a harbinger of the blight that had befallen the land. The livestock, gaunt and hollow-eyed, roamed the fields with an air of impending doom, their mournful cries a dirge for the dying farm. Jake felt like a ghost wandering through the remnants of a life he once knew, his presence an afterthought in the vast expanse of decay. The divorce had torn his world asunder, leaving him adrift in a sea of sorrow, a single grain of wheat lost in an endless field of ash. The horizon, once a beacon of days to come, now loomed like a guillotine, its edge sharp against the brooding sky. Jake's mother had vanished into the city's maw, leaving behind a trail of whispers that echoed in the empty halls of the farmhouse. The farm was alive, not with growth, but with a malevolent force that whispered from the furrows and slithered along the fence lines. The animals, once docile, now eyed Jake with a primal recognition, as if they knew the darkness that seeped from the ground. Night fell like a shroud, and with it came the shadows, longer and more sentient than any that had come before. They clung to Jake, tendrils of despair that sought to drag him into the abyss that had opened beneath the farm. In his dreams, Jake was haunted by visions of a past soaked in blood, of ancestors whose sins had seeped into the soil. He awoke to a silence so profound it screamed, the farm's heartbeat now a macabre echo of the horrors that lay buried beneath its surface. The farm was no longer just a patchwork of fields, it was a mosaic of nightmares, each piece a reflection of the torment that festered in Jake's soul. As the chapter closes, the farm's true nature begins to unfurl, a tapestry of terror that ensnares Jake in its grim weave. The game had begun, a chess match with the devil, and Jake was a pawn on a board where the squares were graves and the pieces were made of bone. Chapter 2. The Shack. The sun was a dim orb, smothered by the thick, gray clouds that hung low over the Harper farm. Jake, with a restlessness that had become his constant companion, wandered to the farthest edge of the property, where the land whispered of untold stories. There, hidden behind a veil of overgrown brambles and the twisted skeletons of dead trees, stood the shack. It was a decrepit structure, its wood weathered to a ghostly gray, the roof sagging under the weight of neglect. The door hung askew, barely clinging to its hinges, and a broken chain lay coiled on the ground like a dead snake. Jake approached the shack, his heart pounding a rhythm of morbid fascination. The air grew colder as he neared, the silence of the place seeping into his bones. He could almost feel the eyes of the farm upon him, watching, waiting. With a trembling hand, he pushed the door open, the rusted hinges screaming in protest. The stench that greeted him was a miasma of mold and decay, a scent that clawed at the back of his throat. The interior was shrouded in darkness, the light from the door revealing only fragments of the horror within. Old furniture lay scattered, the remnants of a life long abandoned. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light, and cobwebs draped the corners like shrouds. But it was the walls that drew Jake's gaze, the walls that held the secrets of the shack. They were covered in markings, symbols that twisted and writhed in the dimness, as if alive. Words were scrawled in a hand that spoke of desperation, a message left by someone long consumed by the shadows. Jake's eyes traced the lines, a sense of dread building within him. Bound by blood, sealed by sin, he read aloud, his voice a whisper in the tomb-like silence. Here lies the gate, where the end begins. A chill ran down his spine, and he stumbled backward, the words echoing in his mind. The shack was not just a relic, it was a tomb, a prison for something ancient and malevolent. The broken chain on the ground suddenly seemed ominous, a failed attempt to contain the darkness that lurked within these walls. Jake's curiosity turned to fear, a realization dawning on him that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. He turned to leave, to flee the suffocating embrace of the shack, but a sound stopped him cold. A soft, rasping whisper that seemed to come from the very earth beneath his feet. It was a voice, or many voices, a chorus of the damned that rose in a crescendo of madness. Jake ran, the shack receding into the distance, but the whispers followed, a relentless tide that threatened to drown him. He knew, with a certainty that sank like a stone in his gut, that the shack held more than just secrets, it held a curse, one that had now claimed him as its own. As he reached the safety of the farmhouse, the last light of day bled from the sky, and the farm settled into a watchful silence. But for Jake, there would be no peace. The shack and its whispers had etched themselves into his soul, a grim chapter in the horror that was unfolding. Chapter 3, The Whispering Wind. The wind had a voice, a soft, insidious whisper that slithered through the leaves and into the very marrow of Jake's bones. It was a nocturnal symphony, a chorus of hushed tones that spoke of ancient secrets and long-forgotten truths. As Jake lay in his bed, the sounds seeped through the cracks of the farmhouse, a serenade of the unseen that beckoned him with an eerie allure. His father, a man of the earth, dismissed the sounds as mere rustlings of nature, the leaves dancing to the tune of the breeze. But Jake knew better. This was no ordinary wind, it was a harbinger, a spectral messenger that murmured in a language not meant for mortal ears. Each night, the whispering grew more insistent, a persistent call that tugged at the frayed edges of Jake's soul. It seemed to emanate from the direction of the shack, that dilapidated relic that harbored darkness within its rotting walls. The broken chain outside its door, now a symbol of his own shackled fate, rattled in harmony with the wind's cryptic cadence. Jake's dreams were infested with visions of the shack, its image a stain upon his subconscious. He saw the symbols on the walls come alive, writhing and contorting as if in agony. The words he had read there, bound by blood, sealed by sin, echoed in the hollows of his mind, a mantra of doom that he could not silence. The farm, once a sanctuary of simplicity and life, had become a prison of paranoia and fear. The whispering wind was its warden, a spectral jailer that watched over him with unseen eyes. The animals, too, seemed to listen to the wind's whispers, their behavior growing more erratic with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire, Jake made a decision. He would confront the source of the whispers, seek out the shack under the cloak of darkness, and unravel the mystery that held him captive. Armed with nothing but a lantern and his waning courage, Jake ventured into the night. The wind greeted him like an old acquaintance, its whispers now a cacophony that swirled around him. The path to the shack was a gauntlet of shadows and doubt, each step heavier than the last. As he reached the shack, the wind's whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. The broken chain danced wildly, as if in the throes of possession. Jake's hand hesitated on the door, his heart a drumbeat of terror. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open and stepped into the maw of the unknown. The interior was as he remembered, a mausoleum of memories and madness. But now, the markings on the walls pulsed with a sinister energy, the symbols glowing with an otherworldly light. The whispers were here, inside, 1,000 voices that filled the shack with their lament. Jake's lantern flickered, the light struggling against the darkness that sought to extinguish it. The whispers grew louder, more demanding, their language a puzzle that clawed at the edges of his understanding. And then, amidst the chaos of sound, Jake heard it, a single, clear voice that cut through the din. It spoke his name, a whisper that was both a caress and a curse. Jake's blood ran cold, the realization dawning on him that the wind's secrets were meant for him alone. He was the key, the blood-bound descendant of a lineage that had sown the seeds of their own destruction. The shack was not just a building, it was a gateway, a portal that had been sealed with the blood of his ancestors. And now, with the shackles of the past broken, the gate was opening, and the darkness that had been contained was seeping into the world. Jake fled the shack, the whispers chasing him like hounds on the hunt. He knew that he could not outrun the wind, nor could he silence the voices that now resided within him. The fawn was no longer his home, it was the epicenter of a horror that he had unwittingly unleashed. As he collapsed onto his bed, the whispers enveloping him like a shroud, Jake understood the true nature of the wind. It was a whispering wind, a bearer of truths too grim for the light of day. And as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Jake Harper was no more. In his place was a vessel for the whispering wind, a conduit for the ancient secrets that would soon engulf the world. Chapter 4, The Hole. As the sun's last embers faded into twilight, Jake found himself drawn once more to the forsaken shack, guided by the whispers that had become his constant shadow. The shack stood as a sentinel at the edge of reality, its decrepit form a stark contrast against the darkening sky. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of ancient voices that beckoned him closer with their siren call. Before him lay the hole, a gaping maw in the wooden floor of the shack, its edges jagged and worn. Something within its depths glinted faintly, catching the dying light, a beacon in the abyss. The hole was scarcely wider than the breadth of a child, an invitation to secrets untold. The earth around it pulsed rhythmically, as if the very ground harbored a living heartbeat. With trepidation etched into his features, Jake knelt before the opening, the whispers now a roar in his ears. He could feel the vibrations through his palms as he touched the soil, a syncopated thumping that resonated with his own heart. The darkness below was impenetrable, a void that promised both terror and enlightenment. The decision to descend was made in a heartbeat, a moment of reckless courage or perhaps inevitable fate. Jake lowered himself into the hole, his body contorting to fit the narrow passage. The earth embraced him, cool and damp, as he began his descent into the bowels of the farm. Down he went, the passage constricting around him, the whispers now a physical presence that caressed his skin. The glinting object beckoned him deeper, a siren's lure that he could not resist. The darkness consumed him, a shroud that blinded his eyes yet heightened his other senses. Time lost meaning as Jake crawled through the earthen tunnel, the walls pressing close, threatening to swallow him whole. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of decay and the tang of rust. The thumping grew louder, a drumbeat that matched the pounding of his pulse. Suddenly, the passage opened into a cavernous space, the air cool and still. Jake's eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, and what he saw took his breath away. The chamber was vast, the walls lined with luminescent fungi that cast an eerie glow. At the center of the chamber stood an altar, and upon it lay the source of the glinting light, a crystal, pulsating with an inner fire. The whispers fell silent, a hush that was almost reverent. Jake approached the altar, his movements slow and deliberate. The crystal pulsed in response, its light growing brighter with each of Jake's steps. It was as if the crystal was alive, aware of his presence. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the crystal. A surge of energy shot through him, a torrent of images and emotions that flooded his mind. Visions of the past, of his ancestors bound by blood and sin, of rituals and sacrifices made in the name of power. The crystal's light enveloped him, a cocoon that peeled back the layers of his soul. Jake saw the farm not as it was, but as it had been, a place of dark rites and darker secrets. The hole, the shack, the farm, they were all part of a legacy that had been buried, hidden from the eyes of the world. But now, the seal was broken, and the darkness that had been contained was free once more. The crystal, a key to the shackles of the past, had chosen Jake as its bearer. He was the heir to a curse that spanned generations, a curse that now flowed through his veins. The chamber began to shake, a rumble that grew into a roar. The walls cracked, the fungi dimmed, and the crystal's light flickered. Jake knew he had to leave, to escape the collapsing chamber and the revelations it held. He scrambled back to the passage, dropping the crystal in his haste. The earth trembled around him, a beast in its death throes. Jake emerged from the hole just as the shack gave a final groan and collapsed into itself, the whispers silenced beneath a cloud of dust. As he stood there, panting and covered in dirt, Jake realized that the farm would never be the same. The hole had been a gateway, and he had crossed its threshold. The whispers might have been silenced, but their echoes would linger, a haunting melody that would follow him to the ends of the earth. The crystal was a testament to the truth he had uncovered. The farm, the shack, the hole, they were all part of him now, a symphony of horror that played on an endless loop. Chapter 5, The Other Side. The descent was a maelstrom, a vortex that wrenched Jake from the world he knew and flung him into the abyss. The earth's grip was unyielding, a pressure that stole his breath and threatened to crush his very being. He tumbled through the void, a lone voyager in the darkness that stretched into infinity. When the tumult subsided, and Jake found himself expelled onto foreign soil, he realized with a visceral shock that he was no longer in Oklahoma. The sky above was a tapestry of sickly green, swirling with unnatural clouds that seemed to pulse with malevolence. Twisted trees, their limbs gnarled and reaching, clawed at the air as if in agony. The ground beneath his feet was alive, squirming and writhing as though it possessed a mind of its own. It was a landscape that defied reason, a realm where the laws of nature held no sway. Jake had stepped through a threshold into another world, a place that was anathema to all he understood. He stood there, a solitary figure amidst the chaos of this alien terrain, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and wonder. The whispers that had guided him here were silent now, leaving him in a void of isolation that was more terrifying than any voice could be. The air was thick, heavy with a scent that was both sweet and putrid, a perfume that spoke of decay and rebirth. The sky seemed to lower, pressing down upon the land with an oppressive weight. The trees swayed, not with the wind, but with a rhythm that suggested a sinister sentience. Jake's gaze was drawn to the horizon, where the green of the sky met the undulating earth. There, silhouetted against the eerie glow, were structures, buildings of a design that was both alien and familiar. They were twisted parodies of human architecture, spires that spiraled into grotesque forms, walls that pulsed as if they were made of living flesh. With each step he took, the ground squelched beneath his feet, the sensation unnerving in its intimacy. The landscape seemed to watch him, a thousand unseen eyes tracking his progress. Jake felt a pull, an inexorable draw toward the twisted city on the horizon. As he ventured closer, the details of the city became clearer. The buildings were adorned with carvings, depictions of creatures that defied description, beings with too many limbs, eyes that stared from impossible angles, mouths filled with needle-like teeth. The city was silent, a mausoleum of otherworldly design. The streets were empty, the doorways gaping maws that led into shadowy interiors. Jake's footsteps echoed on the strange pavement, a lonely sound that seemed to be swallowed by the city itself. He wandered the streets, a ghost in a ghost town, searching for any sign of life or explanation. The silence was oppressive, a tangible force that seemed to mock his plight. The city was a labyrinth, its layout nonsensical, a maze constructed by a mind that reveled in chaos. Jake came upon a square, the center of which was dominated by a statue. It was a monument to the city's inhabitants, a towering figure that was both majestic and horrifying. The statue depicted one of the creatures from the carvings, its many arms outstretched as if in welcome or warning. The base of the statue bore an inscription, words etched in a language that Jake could not comprehend, yet somehow understood. "Here lies the threshold, the nexus of worlds," it read. "Beware the guardians, for they watch the gates." A shiver ran down Jake's spine, the realization dawning on him that he was not alone. The city might be silent, but it was not abandoned. He was being observed, evaluated by the guardians of this nexus. The ground trembled, a subtle vibration that grew in intensity. The city came alive, not with sound, but with movement. The buildings pulsed, the carvings writhed, and the statue's eyes seemed to fix upon Jake with an unsettling focus. He ran, the instinct to flee overriding all else. The city was a trap, a prison for those who traversed the hole. The guardians were stirring, roused by his presence, and Jake knew that to be caught would be to face a fate worse than death. The green sky darkened as he raced back toward the hole, the city a nightmare that receded into the distance. The ground heaved and bucked, an entity that sought to hinder his escape. But Jake was driven by a primal terror, a need to return to the world he knew. He reached the hole, a mere slit in the fabric of this reality, and threw himself into its embrace. The descent was a reversal of his arrival, a journey back through the darkness that clawed at his soul. When he emerged on the other side, gasping and covered in the detritus of that other place, Jake lay on the familiar earth of Oklahoma. The sky was a comforting blanket of blue, the trees benign in their stillness. But the world he returned to was not the same. Jake had seen what lay beyond, had glimpsed the other side. And though he was back on his farm, the whispers returned, a reminder that the hole was a gateway that swung both ways. The guardians were watching, and Jake knew that his journey was far from over. The nexus had been opened, and the other side would not be denied. Chapter 6: The Monster Revised. The Twilight Realm stretched endlessly before Jake, a tableau of desolation under the oppressive gray sky. And there, in the distance, stood the monster, a grotesque sentinel of the world he had unwittingly unveiled. Its skin was a tapestry of lesions, oozing with the ichor of nightmares, and its eyes, two dying embers set in a visage of eternal torment, burned with a malevolent intelligence. It was an abomination, a chimera of flesh and fear, its form a perverse fusion of man and beast. Its limbs, elongated and sinewy, moved with a grace that belied their monstrous nature, each step a silent testament to the creature's predatory prowess. The monster's voice, when it came, was a symphony of agony and hunger, a sound that clawed at the edges of Jake's mind. "You've unlocked the gateway," it rasped, each word a serrated blade that cut through the stillness of the alien world. Jake's heart was a drumbeat of terror, pounding against the cage of his ribs with a fervor that threatened to burst forth. What had he done? In his quest for answers, had he become the harbinger of his own doom? "You do not understand the forces you have stirred," the monster continued, its tone a mocking dirge. "The gateway you have opened is a path to the Ancient Ones, beings whose hunger knows no bounds." Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, the weight of his actions crashing down upon him like the hammer of judgment. The hole, the shack, the whispers, they had all been pieces of a puzzle he had blindly solved, unlocking a door that should have remained forever sealed. The monster advanced, its movements a dance of death, each step a deliberate measure that closed the distance between predator and prey. "Your world will be their feast," it intoned, its voice a harbinger of the apocalypse. Desperation lent Jake strength, and he turned to flee, to somehow undo the catastrophe he had unleashed. But the ground beneath his feet squirmed, the earth itself an accomplice to the monster's pursuit. He glanced back, only to see the monster's form blur and shift, its body contorting in ways that defied reality. It was a master of its domain, a creature that transcended the laws of physics and biology. "You cannot escape," the monster taunted, its voice a vortex that sought to swallow Jake's hope. "You are marked by the gateway, a beacon for those who would devour your world." Jake's mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to close the gateway and banish the monster back to the depths from which it had come. He remembered the shack, the whispers, the hole, a sequence of events that had led him here. The monster lunged, a blur of malice and hunger, but Jake was ready. He dodged, his movements fueled by adrenaline and terror. The monster's claws raked the air where Jake had stood moments before, a near miss that sent shivers down his spine. The chase was on, a deadly game of cat and mouse through the twisted landscape. Jake ran, his lungs burning, his mind a whirlwind of panic and determination. He had to reach the hole, the nexus point, the only hope of sealing the gateway. The ground heaved and bucked, an entity that sought to hinder his escape. But Jake was driven by a primal terror, a need to return to the world he knew. Chapter 7: The Struggle. The night was thick with the scent of rain and fear. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, a staccato rhythm that matched the creature's every move. The monster lunged again, its claws a blur of deathly precision. Jake dodged, feeling the air slice beside him, a whisper away from his flesh. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on a loose floorboard. The shack, a ramshackle structure of wood and memories, groaned under the assault. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts a tangled mess of strategy and survival. He needed a weapon, something to turn the tide in this dance of death. His eyes scanned the dim interior, landing on the fireplace. Embers glowed, a faint promise of warmth and light. Beside it, the poker, a slender chance, but a chance nonetheless. Jake lunged for it, his fingers wrapping around the cool metal. The creature howled, a sound that clawed at the walls and at Jake's resolve. With a roar of his own, Jake swung the poker, connecting with a sickening thud. The monster recoiled, its eyes burning with malice and pain. Jake didn't wait to see the effect. He struck again and again, each hit a desperate plea for life. The creature's movements became erratic, its attacks less coordinated. Jake sensed the shift, the slight faltering of an indomitable foe. He pressed on, his own pain lost in a flood of adrenaline. Blood dripped from his knuckles, painting the floor with his determination. The shack shuddered, a final protest against the violence within its walls. A crack splintered through the air, louder than thunder, as a beam gave way. Daylight streamed in, a blade of hope cutting through the darkness. Jake squinted against the sudden light, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The monster was weakening, its breaths coming in ragged gasps. Jake knew this was his moment, his only chance to end the nightmare. He gathered his strength, his spirit, and with a cry that echoed through the forest, he delivered the final blow. The poker found its mark, and the creature stilled, its life extinguished by a human's will to survive. Jake collapsed, the poker clattering to the floor. His breaths were heavy, his body aching with the aftermath of battle. But he was alive. He had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. The shack, once a place of solace, now lay in ruins around him. The walls that had protected him now exposed him to the world. But it didn't matter. Jake had won more than a fight, he had won his freedom. As he stood, the pain of his wounds a stark reminder of the struggle, he knew his journey was far from over. There would be more monsters, more battles. But for now, Jake savored the victory, the sweet triumph over the beast that had sought to consume him. The struggle was over, but the war raged on. And Jake, with scars etched into his flesh and soul, was ready for whatever came next. Chapter 8: The Gateway's Curse. The shack's timbers groaned, a dirge for the fallen beast as its lifeblood seeped into the earth. Jake watched, horror-struck, as the ground beneath him undulated like the back of some great, slumbering beast. The walls, once his refuge, now wept with a thick, black ichor that oozed like the lifeblood of the underworld. A chill descended upon the room, a cold that seeped into Jake's bones and gripped his heart with icy fingers. The darkness grew, a tangible presence that sought to smother his very soul. The whispers that had once been but a faint murmur in the back of his mind now rose to a cacophony of screams, each one a symphony of pain and torment that echoed from the abyss. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps, his eyes wide as he searched the gloom for an escape. But there was none. The monster's death had opened a gateway, a portal to a realm of darkness and despair. And from that gateway, a curse had been unleashed. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of decay and the promise of oblivion. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and writhing in a grotesque ballet. Jake felt the darkness pressing in on him, a weight that threatened to crush him. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on something solid. He looked down to see the monster's heart, a blackened mass that pulsed with a malevolent energy. It was the source of the curse, the key to the gateway that had been opened. With trembling hands, Jake reached for the heart. It was slick with ichor, and it throbbed in his grasp, a grotesque parry of life. He knew what he had to do. With a cry that was half prayer, half defiance, Jake hurled the heart into the fire. The effect was immediate. The heart burst into flames, a conflagration that burned with a fierce, otherworldly light. The darkness recoiled, the shadows screaming as they were consumed by the fire. The ground settled, the walls ceased their weeping, and the air cleared. The gateway was closing, the curse being undone. Jake watched as the last of the shadows were devoured by the flames, and a sense of peace settled over the shack. He had done it. He had broken the curse and closed the gateway. But at what cost? The shack was in ruins, the forest beyond lay shrouded in mist, and the path ahead was uncertain. Jake stepped out of the shack, the light of the fire casting long shadows behind him. He was alone, but he was alive. And as long as he lived, he would fight against the darkness that sought to claim him. The gateway's curse had been lifted, but Jake knew this was only the beginning. There were more battles to be fought, more demons to face. But for now, he had won a small victory in the war against the darkness. And that was enough. Chapter 9, The Shadow's Embrace. Jake's breaths came in ragged gasps as the shadows coiled tighter, their icy tendrils seeping into his skin. The darkness was alive, whispering sinister lullabies that promised an end to all his suffering. He could feel the cold embrace of the void as it beckoned him closer to the gaping maw in the floor of the decrepit shack. The Sentinel, a grotesque creature of twisted limbs and gaping maws, had been but a guardian to this gateway of despair. Its defeat had unleashed the true horror that lay beneath, a darkness so profound it seemed to devour the very light around it. Jake's mind raced, desperate for a plan, a way to escape the inevitable. The shadows murmured of ancient pacts and forgotten gods, their voices a cacophony of madness in his ears. He struggled against the pull, his muscles burning with the effort, but the darkness was relentless. Memories flashed before his eyes, his childhood home, the warmth of his mother's embrace, the laughter of his friends. These glimpses of a life once lived were being consumed by the encroaching gloom, each one snuffed out like a candle in a tempest. The hole in the floor seemed to pulse with a malevolent hunger, its edges writhing like the maw of some great beast. Jake could hear the faint cries of souls long lost to its depths, their wails a testament to the fate that awaited him. He thought of Sarah, her smile the last bastion of hope in his crumbling world. The thought of her gave him strength, a fleeting surge of defiance against the oppressive dark. With a Herculean effort, he tore one arm free, reaching out to the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the wooden walls. But the shadows were quick to react, their formless bodies swirling into a vortex of despair. They struck with the force of a tempest, battering his will, his resolve. Jake felt his grip on reality slipping, the edges of his vision fraying as the darkness sought to claim him. In a final act of desperation, he screamed into the void, a primal cry that echoed the terror and rage that had built within him. The sound reverberated through the shack, shaking the foundations, stirring something ancient and powerful. The shadows hesitated, their whispers faltering. A sliver of light pierced the gloom, a ray of hope in the overwhelming darkness. Jake seized the moment, pulling with all his might against the spectral chains that bound him. The floorboards groaned and splintered as he dragged himself inch by agonizing inch toward the light. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissipating like mist before the rising sun. Jake's fingers brushed against the cool earth outside the shack, the fresh air a balm to his beleaguered spirit. With one final effort, he freed himself from the shadow's embrace, collapsing onto the ground outside the hole. The hole in the shack's floor remained, a silent sentinel to the horrors that lurked beneath. But for now, Jake was safe, the darkness held at bay by his sheer will to survive. He lay there, panting, his body aching from the ordeal. The sun's rays warmed his face, a stark contrast to the cold dread that had enveloped him. Jake knew the fight was far from over, the shadows would return, but he also knew he had won this battle. Chapter 10, The Consuming Dark. The shadows pulled Jake deeper into the abyss, the hole in the shack's floor a gateway to a realm of terror. He could no longer tell up from down as the darkness enveloped him, a suffocating blanket that extinguished all light and hope. In this void, Jake was alone, utterly and hopelessly alone. There was no Sarah, no beacon of love to cling to, only the oppressive weight of an eternal night. The darkness was a living thing, a malevolent force that whispered of despair and fed on his fear. It was an ancient entity, one that existed long before the dawn of man, lurking in the places where reality thinned and the barriers between worlds grew weak. It desired more than his life, it hungered for his very essence, his soul, to add to the chorus of the damned that it had consumed over the eons. Jake's screams were lost in the void, his voice joining the wails of countless others who had fallen prey to the shadow. There was no fight left in him, no defiance, only the inevitable acceptance of his fate. The darkness seeped into his bones, filled his lungs, and clouded his mind. Memories of his life on the surface, a life that now seemed like a distant dream, flickered and faded. The moments of joy and pain, the sun on his face, the wind in his hair, all were devoured by the insatiable dark. As the last vestiges of his identity were stripped away, Jake became part of the darkness. His body dissolved, his mind fragmented, until there was nothing left but the shadow that had claimed him. And in his final moments, as the consuming dark took everything, Jake understood the truth of this place. It was not just a prison or a tomb, it was the end of all things, where light and life came to die. The void claimed him wholly, and Jake was no more. His screams subsided, his struggles ceased, and the darkness grew a fraction darker with the addition of his soul. The hole in the shack closed, the shadows retreated, and the night reclaimed its silent dominion. The shack stood empty, a silent sentinel to the horrors that had transpired within. The darkness had won, as it always did, and the world above remained oblivious to the battle that had raged beneath its surface. And so, the story of Jake ended, not with a triumph or a rescue, but with the cold embrace of the consuming dark. The farm fell into ruin, the fields withered, and the livestock vanished. Jake's father searched for him until his dying day, never knowing his son's fate. The locals spoke of the farm in hushed tones, warning their children to steer clear of the cursed land. And the shack stood there, a gaping maw waiting for the next curious soul to stumble upon it, as the whispers on the wind beckoned them closer.